Welcome to the Progressive Primitivist podcast, where we believe that the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. One of the most obvious differences between most churches of Christ and other churches is the fact that most churches of Christ worship God a cappella. I grew up in the Baptist church, and my first time to visit a service of Churches of Christ happened my junior year of high school. And as I walked in that little modest white frame building and looked at the front of the auditorium, I thought it was strange not to see a piano or an organ, as I'd grown up seeing in Baptist churches. Why is it the case that most Churches of Christ choose to worship a cappella? Well, you're watching one of a series of 3 videos in which Brother Everett Ferguson, Professor Emeritus at Abilene Christian University, presents his rationale for choosing to worship a cappella. These lectures are based upon a book that Brother Ferguson wrote on the subject, which many believe to be the finest book on this subject. We hope you enjoy these lessons.
Some of you have indicated some difficulty in locating a copy of the book. They had them at the beginning of lectureship at the tent, but I presume it must have sold out or something because they were missing yesterday. But the bookstore delivered some additional copies to the tent. They've had them in the bookstore all along. But there were, at least yesterday afternoon, some more copies in the tent. So if some of you did not get your copy and would still like to do so, it is available there. A cappella music in the public worship of the church. I suppose if I were writing this this morning, instead of having written it a year or two ago, after hearing Brother Bishop's paper at Biblical Forum last night, I would revise my terminology somewhat. But I think I was feeling towards something of the same thing he was saying with a great deal more clarity and force. When I put the word public worship in the title, I was trying to make a distinction in reference to the assembly of the church. It is when we come together that the church is truly the church, is truly the assembly of the people of God. And in talking about public worship here, I did have in mind our use of the word worship in reference to what we do in the public assembly. And I suppose it would be more in keeping with biblical terminology if we had entitled this a cappella music in the assembly of the church. We'll perhaps need to modify the wording of some other statements that I make today, and I probably will not be consistent in trying to accommodate to that. But today we turn to the third part of our subject, the doctrinal considerations in reference to unaccompanied singing in the church. We have in our earlier lessons examined the New Testament evidence in the light of the history of the Greek word psallo and in the light of the musical practices of pagans and Jews in early Christian times. And then we have examined the testimony of church history, what the writings of the early church fathers have to tell us about the practice of the ancient church. Now today we come to look and see if there are some doctrinal reasons which undergird this New Testament evidence and this church history evidence. To my mind, this is really the most important, the most crucial consideration. I do not consider myself primarily a theologian. I'm primarily a historian. And so understandably, therefore, the second part of my book is about half the book, and the third chapter, on what I'm telling you now is the most important, is only about 1/6 in length of the book. And I have learned a great deal from others in thinking about the doctrinal considerations here, and I think other people probably could do a great deal more with it. Nevertheless, it does seem to me there are some important doctrinal considerations that are not pressed or have not been pressed as much as I think they should be in consideration of this question. And several who have read and used the book have said that they thought those last few pages were the most important part of the book because it did deal with something that had been neglected in the past. And they too shared my feeling that really it's the nature of what we do when we come together in the assembly that is the crucial question and is the underlying consideration here, that whatever other arguments might be made, that the real concern here should be what is fitting and what is appropriate when we come into the presence of God in a special way. And so in the last chapter of the book we consider 4 points under the heading of doctrinal considerations. 3 of these are properly doctrinal or theological. The 4th one is more in the nature of a musicological consideration. And so we'll set it somewhat aside from the first 3 in what we have to say this morning. Points 1 and 2 have to do with the Godward side of our service to God, or the Godward side of our worship. If we understand worship as pertaining to all of life, as having to do with all that man does in service to God, then it has 2 references. It is service rendered under God and service rendered with reference to Him. And it also includes service to our fellow man, to one another. And these first 2 points have to do with what man does in his religious service with reference to God. We have argued from the nature of worship and from the character of New Testament worship as spiritual worship in the first 2 points in this 3rd chapter. In regard to the nature of worship, I have suggested that what man does in reference to God and in service to God must be appointed by God. That man comes to God on God's terms and not on his own terms. That our religious activities are grounded in our relation to God. We come as the creature to the Creator. And that means that our gifts to God are those gifts that God appoints for us to do. And then particularly when we come together in the assembly, when the church is the church in its most concrete sense, then we do those things that God appoints to be done in the assembly. And both of these considerations, that is, what we're doing in reference to God is determined by God's commands, and that what we do in the assembly is what God authorizes to do in the assembly, suggests that we must have an explicit authorization from God, that we are not free to do as we please in these kinds of settings. There are many areas where man does have freedom, where God leaves to his spiritual judgment of what he does and how he carries out certain activities. But I would suggest there is a special character to the Christian assembly, that when the church is together as the church, That means that here we do the things that God appoints for us to do on that occasion. When we meet around the Lord's table to partake of the supper, we break bread and we drink of the fruit of the vine, because that is what is specified there. It is authorized, and it has a special relationship to man's salvation. And so it is an important doctrinal activity. This would be what I mean by the nature of worship, that it is God-determined and not man-chosen. And the New Testament in a number of passages speaks of spiritual worship, or that would be in 1 Peter 2:5, or of rational worship in Romans 12:1. This is perhaps not the best translation here, but I don't know an exact equivalent in English to express the idea. When we say something like rational worship, we think of something in contrast to emotional worship. We think of something intellectual. Some versions have said this is your reasonable service, but then we often use that term to mean something that's reasonable, something that's natural. I can immediately think of a good synonym for it. But in both of these translations, rational and reasonable, the translators were trying to get at the idea of something that comes from the reasoning nature of man, rather than being something purely intellectual, as we might think of it, or something that we might think answers to the canons of reason and is in accord with rational activity. This is not what the phrase means. It was used in the context of ancient writers of that which is not material, that which is not pertaining to animal sacrifice, especially in the philosophical criticism of pagan religion. This term that's translated rational or reasonable here was used in contrast to what you did when animals were being sacrificed. And it was used in contrast to that which pertained to external things, that which pertained to material activities and sacrifice. And instead it put its emphasis on the interior nature of man, the highest quality of man which distinguished him from the rest of God's creation. And I think Paul in Romans 12:1 thus is expressing essentially what Peter is saying in 1 Peter 2:5, where he speaks of spiritual worship. And maybe the word spiritual communicates better to us than the usual translations of Romans 12, verse 1. Of course, again, then the word spiritual can be a very vague and diffuse word in our usage. But in both passages, it has to do with that nature of man, which is spirit, which exercises the mind. And it's saying that man's service to God comes from that part of his nature, that part of him which is in the image of God, that part of him which is capable of contact with God, capable of a relationship with God. And drawing on that terminology, then I make the suggestion, again, these are, I'm sure, matters of judgment, and they're matters of interpretation and would be subject to more discussion, which would be quite in order. But again, it seems to me that there is a kind of worship that fits this better than some other things do. You may not be able to prove it with all of the degrees of certainty that you would like. You may not be able to nail it down the way you would like to, but it still seems to me that there are some activities that are more in keeping with these standards of service to God than some other activities are. And in reference to music, I think in particular vocal music is much more in keeping with these descriptions of man's service to God than instrumental music is. Instrumental music has to do with something external. It has to do with something that is material, whereas vocal music has to do with something that comes from the self. The whole self is involved in vocal music in a way that it is not, and I suppose almost any other activity that we engage in. In fact, some of the early church fathers make a point very comparable to this, that if we truly are singing with the heart, that if our songs are not just repeating words, but are really coming from our spiritual nature, then the whole being of man is involved here. And that this is in keeping with the spiritual nature of man. This is something particularly appropriate for the contact of spirit with spirit. As man as a spiritual being is praising and honoring and glorifying the God who made him, that vocal expressions of praise fit this standard or this criterion of man's service to God. Then in the third point in chapter 3, we introduce the criterion of edification, and here we turn to the manward side of our service to God, the manward direction of the Christian assembly. And the passages in the New Testament which speak to the purposes which are to be accomplished when Christians come together put the emphasis right here, that this is to be a time when we edify one another. And this is the criterion Paul introduces in 1 Corinthians 14 as to what the Corinthians are to do when they come together. And it's on this criterion that he rules out the speaking in tongues which are not understood by other members of the assembly. And he says, I had rather speak 5 words that edify than thousands of words in a tongue that is not understood by others. And in our service to God, we are concerned with one another. Worship, in New Testament terminology, is not just what is offered to God. It is also what we do for one another. And a primary purpose of the Christian assembly is that we edify one another. And these passages that are usually quoted on the kind of music to be used in the church, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, have both this Godward and this manward reference about them. You sing to God, but you're also teaching, admonishing one another. And so it's something directed to God, but also with reference to one another. And when we introduce this standard of edification, I think once more we have something with which vocal music is quite in accord, but with which instrumental music has nothing to do, and indeed might, although I would grant not necessarily, but might even interfere with. In vocal music, you can edify one another. You can teach. You can admonish. But instrumental music affects the senses. Now, it can be quite elevating. The instrumental music need not appeal only to the lower senses of man. It can appeal to the higher senses of man. But still, it essentially does not have anything to do with edification. And maybe I should have said a little bit more about edification in the book, because I found that sometimes people misunderstand that word. When you speak of something being edifying, often sometimes a person thinks that means what makes them feel good or what uplifts them. You know, I felt very edified about something. And I mean by that, well, I got an uplifting feeling out of it. This is not what edification means in the Scriptures. Edification means to build up. And if you look at the context where it is used, it is in a context where instruction takes place, where you learn, where you are encouraged, where you are brought closer to one another and brought closer to God. And the same arguments that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 14 to eliminate unintelligible sounds, when those sounds are vocal, I think have an equal and perhaps an even greater amount of force when directed against sounds which are purely mechanical, no matter how beautiful or of high quality those particular sounds might be. Now, the fourth area of the book is one where I feel particularly incompetent, in that we really ought to have a musicologist writing on it. But it seems to me that not only theologically, not only liturgically, that is what you do in the worshiping assembly, not only is instrumental music theologically inappropriate, but it seems to me that it is musicologically inappropriate, if I don't lose you with that way of expressing it. I referred yesterday to attending some services of Greek Orthodox churches in Greece. And in listening to their music, a point came home to me that I had read in the McKinnon thesis that I also referred to yesterday, where he said that instrumental music would have been simply inappropriate from the musical standpoint and theologically too, in the context of Jewish synagogue and early Christian worship, where your type of music was something that was constructed to be purely vocal. And in Greek Orthodox singing, an instrument would be a definite distraction. It just has no place in that kind of thing. And when we think of the classical form of church music, which is what I have described or given some quotations about rather than describing in this last section, I think that we can also say that instrumental music is inappropriate from the musical standpoint in terms of what is the classical, the ancient form of Christian music. Now, this point is probably obscured for us in terms of the kinds of songs that we sing and the music to which they are set. As I've indicated, I am not really competent to speak here, but if I understand what the musicians who are among us are saying, this is the conclusion that I would draw from what these musicians are saying, that so many of the songs that we sing were really songs that were written for a piano or an organ. They are instrumentally scored music, and we just go ahead and sing them a cappella. But they were not written as a cappella music originally. And so the point here is, I think, obscured for us by the kind of songs that are common in our assemblies. And I'm not particularly on a crusade here, because I think musicians ought to decide musical questions and not a theologian. And there are some people here who are musicians, and I'll maybe give them an opportunity to speak to this in a few minutes. But it seems to me that if you're going to have a cappella music, the thrust ought to be in the direction of songs that are written for that kind of expression. And we might be able to understand the difference between the kinds of music here better if we more frequently used the hymns that musicologically are more appropriate for our theology. But that, I think, is a secondary consideration. As I've said, it really belongs apart to these other doctrinal considerations that I've put forward. And really I'm saying that instrumental music is inappropriate theologically in terms of the nature of God, the nature of our service to God, and the nature of our edification one to another. That instrumental music is inappropriate theologically. I think you can also add that it's really inappropriate musicologically in terms of the classical form of Christian music. But certainly that, at least to my mind, is not going to carry the same amount of weight as these properly theological considerations would. Now, maybe this doesn't come through as strongly to you as you would like to have an argument against instrumental music made. I don't know. I think there is a great deal of strength in being able to state the case positively, which is what I've tried to do in these lessons, to make the case for something rather than always just being against something. And that in terms of what we are for, I think we can be quite confident and stand on quite firm ground in saying this is appropriate to sing unaccompanied. We begin to get to somewhat more areas of uncertainty when you then start drawing the negative conclusions. I think you can rightly do that, because if you are for something, as I said the first day, that implies then that you are rejecting something else, that you are against something else. But I think our strongest case is that the Bible authorizes, church history confirms, and doctrine makes most appropriate unaccompanied singing. And if you always state the case in terms of something else being prohibited, you're getting into reasonings, you're getting into inferences, you're getting into deductions, which may be quite correct and may be quite persuasive to you, but they may not persuade somebody else. He may not be as impressed with your logic as you and I are with one another's logic. But when you can state the case in such a way that you do not have to depend upon logical arguments from something, I think you can stand on firmer ground and speak your position with a great deal more confidence. And I feel very secure here that the New Testament authorizes singing. I feel overwhelming confidence about what the testimony of church history is about ancient Christian practice. And I feel quite secure about what is appropriate in terms of the understanding of Christian worship as presented in the New Testament. That we come to God on His terms. We do what He authorizes. It would be presumptuous, I think, to go beyond that. We can see what, in the context of New Testament times, was meant by spiritual worship or by rational worship. And there is a kind of music that is appropriate to that fits that is in keeping with that. Vocal music has to do with the inner nature of man, that part of man that makes contact with the divine Spirit. And when we come together in the assembly, we come together to exhort one another. Hebrews 10:25, 1 Corinthians 14:26, let all that you do be done for edification. And according to that standard, vocal music fits. It may not necessarily be edifying. Just because we sing a cappella, that doesn't mean that our worship is going to satisfy these standards. I feel, unfortunately, that a lot of times a cappella music is not spiritual worship and not edifying to us. You know, just because we do it that way doesn't mean that we meet all of these criteria in worship. But I think this is the kind of music that has the possibility of meeting these criteria, whereas I do not see that instrumental music has that possibility. Well, this basically is what I have to say, and I have not taken the full time this morning, but on our other lessons we have had a great deal more material to cover, and I have not given anyone else an opportunity to speak or to raise questions. I do have a little bit more in the way of a concluding statement, but I'll hold that and see if there is someone who would have a question that they think would be of general interest to the group, or someone who would like to say more on what I have said, or someone even who would like to take issue. It might help keep me honest if we have someone who wants to argue on the other side here. Mike?
Several years ago, Everett, you had a discussion with Dr. Lewis Foster on this subject.
Yes.
I remember it seemed to me like the whole crux of his position, which was in favor of using the instrument, was he said that solo was a neutral word. As I understood, I left my notes from the first day in my briefcase, but as I understand, you said the other day that when we come to Jewish literature and early Christian literature, that you did not find anywhere where you didn't put it in those terms. But so let me ask you this way: have you, or is your understanding a complete absence of the use of solo as this, in this neutral category where it could mean either instrument or singing with an instrument?
The translators who have said make melody in Ephesians 5:19, for instance, may have had some wisdom. There are some passages where that seems to be the distinctive shade, and the word itself does not say either way, whether it's instrumental or vocal. I don't think that means that you can put it in, therefore, in Ephesians 5:19, or some of the other passages where it's not explicitly one way or another. There are a lot of passages where it is explicitly vocal in Jewish and Christian literature. The point is that it does not authorize the instrument per se, and I guess if you just had solo, you might not be able to say, well, it doesn't necessarily authorize exclusively vocal music either. You get the singing from the fact that other words are used, and the exclusiveness comes not from these words, but from our theological principle that what is not authorized is forbidden. But to say that it was neutral in general or in all cases, I don't think you can do that. There are some passages where you just can't securely put any more content into it than that it has to do with melody. But actually, I've found relatively few of those that would fall in that category. Does that answer your question? Yes, Stanley?
Everett, in the light of what you have said, in the light of what Brother Bishop said last night, that worship is a full-orbed concept, in a very practical way, what would you discuss what is going to be the position of the instrument in such things as a funeral service? For example, more and more in larger cities, you're having less and less singers. It's almost impossible at times to get singers. And you usually have that broken in between the obituary reading and scripture prayer. You have your music and then the short lesson. And if that happens there, suppose they have that same service in the church building. Does that make any difference?
Well, I've caught several questions along that line this week. This first one about the funeral has usually been about in the home or informal settings otherwise. So I suppose we ought to discuss that. And I should preface this by saying that this is my judgment at the moment, because I certainly don't feel like I have firm answers, really. I've had to think about it a little bit, but I'm sure not as much as it ought to be thought about, because it's a practical matter for a lot of people. But right now I am inclined to put it in the matter of opinion, and one where we might appropriately have some differences of opinion. But I am inclined to think that it has to be a judgmental decision about a given setting. Let me relate it maybe to what Brother Bishop was saying. I guess some people for whom his idea was new last night are struggling now how to fit that information into their traditional categories of thinking. As I see it, indeed, all of life is worship to God. And that then raises the question in the minds of people, you know, if that's the way you define worship, well, then either you make no distinctions between what you do in the assembly and what you do outside, and therefore you can move the instrument into the assembly if it's all right to play in a band or something, or vice versa, you decide, well, you can never use a religious song to instrumental accompaniment in any kind of setting. But I think that's to misunderstand his point last night. He says that all of life is worship, but he does say there is a difference between what you do in the assembly and what you do other places. The assembly has its own particular purposes. And what you do in the assembly is governed by what those purposes are, which are authorized in Scripture. And that in the assembly there is a different set of rules, as it were, from what you do at home. Jack Boyd's illustration here, and it's a country one, but I guess it's as good as any, is that when he sits down at the dinner table at home, he enjoys steak and potatoes. And in the light of what Brother Bishop said, that's no less a religious activity in a sense, a service to God or worship than something else. But he certainly wouldn't say put steak and potatoes on the Lord's table on Sunday. That just wouldn't fit. It doesn't have to do with what you're authorized to do and what the purposes of the Christian assembly are. And so I think there are some differences between what you do in the assembly and what you do outside the assembly, and that those differences are not governed by what we might call, quote, worship, unquote. Now, to relate this to what he was saying, that all of life is worship. If I sing a religious song in the home, I certainly am going to do it with reverence. But I think right now, my opinion would be that someone could be playing the piano while you're singing that religious song in the home, and that it wouldn't violate anything in Scripture. Because when you're doing it in the home, you might very well be doing it for the enjoyment. I don't think that necessarily makes it sinful that you enjoy something. But when you come together in the assembly, you're not singing a religious song for enjoyment. You might very well enjoy it. All right. But your purpose for doing it is not that. Your purpose there is to give your praise to God and to edify your brother. And so what gives you enjoyment would be out of order there. Now, when you come, though, to making these judgmental decisions, a lot of things have to enter in. You still have to be concerned with your brother or with the non-Christian and what he thinks. And if your use of an instrument with religious music in another setting seems to cast doubt on your consistency or upon your sincerity, or if it seems to be a barrier in the way of teaching something to this other person, then I think it's not only wisdom but Christian charity that you might forego what you might consider is, your freedom, really, but that you would forego it. And I guess the funeral service in particular raises more problems maybe than, what you do with your family at home, or just a small group of Christian friends getting together and singing. I can remember when I was young, some of what we would probably now call some of the strictest and straightest laced church members still like to get together and sing some of the old gospel songs and sing them to a piano at home. They would have really risen up in rebellion if anybody suggested bringing that piano in the church building, but they made a distinction. I've also known, though, a lot of people, and this is my own family background, who just would not do that, wouldn't sing a religious song to an instrument anywhere. And that has at least a certain superficial consistency about it. When you get something like the funeral service, you're getting into something that's not, scripturally authorized. It's something really more of a matter of custom with us that we do, but yet it is something that obviously has religious associations. Now, I'm not much inclined to think that somehow a church building is more sacred than something else, and that you can't do some things there that you can do somewhere else. I just don't see that the Bible ever makes that kind of distinction for us. It doesn't even talk about church buildings, period, there, and human expediency on our side. But the fact that the funeral service has religious associations, and the fact that this building is normally set aside for the Christian assembly, and what you do there is therefore identified in the minds of most people with what your beliefs and convictions are. I would think one would have to be very careful and very cautious there. I'm sure you've had to face the practical situation, or you wouldn't have asked the question, or at least you've been thinking about it, and maybe more so than I have. And as I've indicated, this is sort of where I stand. Maybe these comments will cover a lot of these questions that have been asked earlier in this week, or that you may have in your mind. I said the first day that really all I claim to know something about is the assembly of the church, and that's where my study has been. And I would just as soon not talk about the other. I feel like I know something here, but I don't feel like I know very much about the other. But I am gathering that there is a lot of concern and questioning in the Brotherhood on these other matters right now, that they're not interested in having an instrument in worship, but they are wondering, what about it in other settings? And it's right to raise these questions. I think we need to think about them and explore everything that's involved, and we never will really get right answers unless we're willing to bring the questions out in the open and face them honestly and consider. And there may be some very good considerations that I have not thought of, one way or the other, on this, and I'd be glad to learn them. But right now, I think it's a judgmental matter. One where I think there's freedom, but one where I think you have to be very careful, because I think it might very well create problems. And what something will lead to is not necessarily an argument that makes it wrong, but it is a consideration that means you might ought to leave it off, or at least it might be something that it's well to think very carefully about before you do it. Yes?
Everett, we're dealing, I think, really in the context of striving to understand that we need authority and that the Bible pattern is our concern. And you've emphasized this yesterday by mentioning that in the context of a restorationist, that we're striving to restore or at least maintain the church as the New Testament teaches. With that in mind, we certainly know of no indication where an instrument was used, whether it be in or out of worship. Moreover, I suggest that the 17th verse of Colossians 3 gives a very clear pattern or suggestion that they were to do all things in word and deed in the name of the Lord Jesus. And so for me to exclude certain areas of my life, or to suggest that my worship outside, quote, the assembly or the building, would not be then something that should fall under the pattern of God's plan for worship, gives a certain latitude and a certain kind of freedom that I'm sure is assumed at least as I read the service, and I need some education here from some who might elaborate more. The concern I face, and I'm thinking with Stanley, so often a funeral director will say, well, we don't have singers available on short notice. I have these tapes, and they're prepared, and could I just use those for them? And then you have to make a singular decision. Should I allow it? Should I say, well, fine? Should I let the family decide? What reflection does it bring? And from my standpoint, there's no decision, because for the people who come, they expect it to be a spiritual service, directed to a purpose intended to carry that person from this life to the next one, especially if they're Christian. With that in mind, it reflects upon worship and thus becomes a part of my Christian faith. And for them, they draw the conclusion on that basis. The same is true, I think, with my daughter who plays the piano. If I allow her to play that song with her friends gathered around the piano at home, and then that same evening we gather for worship at the Lord's house, where we believe that the Lord is gathered there and we're worshiping Him in the assembly, what way does she have to explain in any consistent terms her position? Maybe I'll leave that as a question for her.
You know, I think she could, but this would need to be explained all right. But I'm inclined to share with you that the funeral maybe does stand in a little different category here. Several, I guess, want to say something.
Some of you may have seen Brother Roy Lanier Sr.'s article recently, Firm Foundation, where he dealt with this situation in the home. And if I recall, he made this point: when you come together to worship, you don't worship by accident. It's by intent and whatever, and by effort. And thus, you can no more worship in the home playing the piano by, unless that was your intent and purpose, then you can come to church and do this. And he made a distinction here.
Yes, well, I'm inclined to think that, what your intention and your purpose is something very important in determining the differences of the various occasions.
Still won't cover, people might not make that fine a distinction in their reasoning, and so you may still want to not do it.
Yes,
Many of our young people in our public schools are participating in chorus and choral groups. And some have come to me with this question of how can I sing these religious hymns, because many times the chorus will, have a particular religious part in the program.
Yes.
And my answer has always been is worship. And my answer has always been is worship, as we think of it in the corporate sense, cannot be without the intent and purpose. And it's what you're trying to do. But then again, you still have the problem, what are others going to think?
Well, there's much to it. Funeral bit. Most, I found over the last 30 years, that most funeral homes now, at least, do have tapes. Of course, this is mechanically produced again, and I know you can get into like foolish arguments here, but most of them do have acapella singing in their funeral home. And you can specify this. At Houston, where I am now, I never run into trouble because they have acapella tapes. And as I said, they're mechanically produced, and so people say, well, this is just still an instrument. Unless you don't get instrumental music in your funeral service.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Well, first, one thing that's puzzled me a little is, I understand that Brother McGarvey and others, when the instrument was brought in and split the church, that they tolerated it in their services, even though they seem to be more or less neutral about it. And I'm puzzled.
My understanding about Brother McGarvey's practice was, though, that he moved on to other congregations when the instrument was introduced. Now, it may be that some others stayed, but I think about Brother McGarvey that he did move. He was not willing to cut off his associations with those brethren who introduced the music, but he would not meet with them in the assembly. He went to meetings where the instrument was not used. At least that's my understanding about his practice. Your question may not have been primarily about him as a person, though. Did you want to phrase it more generally?
Well, I'm a little puzzled. I say, why some of those men didn't put up a more strenuous objection at that time to the introduction of the instrument, assuming that there were scholarly men. and yet they seem to allow it.
Well, you know, there can be a lot of personal reasons. Maybe it's not as crucial a religious issue, but sometimes the administration does things here that I disagree with. And I think they're wrong. But I decide that for larger reasons, you know, I don't resign every time I get unhappy with something. And something of the same thing may have been at work there. Their personal ties, their feeling that maybe unity is more important than this, or a feeling that if you stay in, you might be able to teach. Or you may decide, well, I think this is wrong, but right now I don't know that firmly. You know, it's a lot easier for us to see something after an issue has been studied and debated 75 or 100 years than it was for those people who were first hit with the idea. You know, I think there may be a lot of things that could be operative here, and not necessarily to be put down as cowardice or lack of faith or lack of conviction on their part. Yes.
Brother Ferguson, in the light of what you said, what are your thoughts on humming in the worship service?
I have none. I guess my initial reaction is that that's mechanical music made with a voice. And not particularly edifying, but maybe that's because I'm not musically attuned. Yes, sir.
I was curious while you were talking about this, about the songs, and the fact that many of these songs that we're singing are songs that men have written for us to sing, and that they wrote them basically for the instrument, that we have left that out. What would be the legitimacy, why not, if we just recited psalms from the Scriptures, as apparently maybe the early church did in their worship, without any kind of music, as we think of it, involved at all, no melody, but the recitation of the song, that this would this fulfill the purposes and be
it might quite well. You know, what constitutes melody, I guess, can get to be a little bit of a complicated question. Everett Fudge at the CEI company has on sale over at the tent some psalms that he has set to familiar tunes, which may serve to revive psalm singing in the church. That might be a healthy thing. Alan, you're just sitting back there smiling about all this, and you ought to know something about this subject. Do you want to comment in any way?
I've been listening. I'm enjoying it. I think that we're pretty well trying to have several standards that were picked up. And I do agree that the music we have is strongly influenced by our present music, by those who have instrumental backgrounds. It would have to be for the last few hundred years. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking for this freedom, you know, people writing their music to come up maybe even with a different type of music than we're familiar with today. I don't have the answer. I don't think we have what we'll probably have a few years from now, even the type of music.
You know, I wouldn't defend all of the new youth songs, I guess, that have come out, but some of them seem to me to have the great virtue of having a very singable simplicity to them that are quite appropriate to to an unaccompanied kind of situation. And it may be that out of some of this putting scripture text to music and some of these newer youth songs, that we may have the sort of thing that you're talking about.
I feel that, I don't want to take too much time, I'd rather listen, but I feel that the absence of any information is what we really had in the early church regarding the singing may indicate that when we are properly attuned to God and with our understanding and in our lives, that the right type of song will actually come from ourselves. And I would like to see this coming. I know I'm influenced so heavily when I write something by my background, which is so closely in tune with the instrumental influence in song, the harmony and all. So I'm looking for this change.
What is done musicologically here, I think is going to vary from one culture to another. I think it's probably well that we don't know, we don't have any scores of music from the first century to know exactly how they sang, because the music is going to be different in Korea from what it is in Africa, from what it is in the United States. And I think this is an area where culture appropriately could dictate rhythm patterns, melody, and those things. Yes.
A question or two back to the funerals and weddings. Who says we have to have music, either vocal or instrumental music, and weddings and funerals? I had a funeral sometime back, church member in a church building. The family requested no music, no singing.
Well, this is custom, on the funeral.
On the other hand, I've had weddings, of course, many times without any music. We pop weddings, come up with a preparation party. I had one of them. They, in the rehearsal, had that beautiful organ music just as smooth as silk, everything going fine. But just as it started playing the music just ahead of the funeral, the wedding, the 220 current blew out of that building, and so we had that one without, they had no singing prepared, so we had that one without any music at all, and some of the more refined people there said, how unique, beautiful ceremony. So maybe we don't have to have it after all.
Right. Sammy, you got us started. I'll let you have last word from the audience, and then I'll make my concluding remarks.
I don't have anything to say on that subject. In regard to the question that he asked a while ago, I think it would be good if we had perhaps everybody saying the 8th Psalm or something. But I believe it was Augustine who said in his definition of a hymn that for it to be a hymn, it had to have three things. It had to have praise, it had to have praise to God, and these had to be sung, whatever that's worth.
Yes, well, we usually think of the melody involved if you're, quote, singing, unquote. Well, sometimes I don't know whether it's wise to open up the group for questions or not, but I think it was wise today. I appreciate the quality of the questions and of the comments, and I think we've all been instructed by what you have contributed to our discussion. Let me conclude now with something that you may think raises a question about why we've spent 3 days on this subject now in the class at all. Instrumental music is, to my mind, in itself a peripheral question. You might say, well, why'd you waste your time writing a book on it? Or why have we had 3 days in a lectureship class on it? Certainly, I think there are some much more crucial questions facing the Church of God today and facing our society than whether we have instrumental music or not in the worship or in the assembly. I consider it in itself a peripheral question. But peripheral questions, things that are unimportant in themselves, can become important either when we make them so or when they are related to an important principle. And I think both of those considerations apply here. The question of instrumental music has become important for us because it has been a point of division. And anything that divides God's people is important. Whether in and of itself it should be important. You know, if we hadn't had an instrumental music controversy that divided our brotherhood, we would not be discussing that question now. I would not have written a book about it. in itself, it probably wouldn't deserve that kind of consideration. There are a lot of things we do religiously, day by day, that nobody takes the trouble to write a book about because they're not controversial. But when something does become controversial, when something becomes important enough to some people that they will not meet together in a common assembly over it, well, then that thing does become important. And something is important if it relates to some fundamental questions of the interpretation of the Bible and your service to God. And it's because I am interested in unity, which I think is a big question and an important question, and because I am interested in our restoring the New Testament church and being the New Testament church today, that I have given attention to what in and of itself I would consider a peripheral question. And I've not written the book to promote or further or encourage division. As I've said, I've tried to take a new approach that would maybe move this question over into a little different ground and advance the discussion. And one reason I want to state it positively rather than stating it negatively is that I'm concerned about unity. And when something divides God's people, I think that becomes important, no matter whether the thing itself that divided them is important. And when something is related to your fundamental principles of your religious program, and you know, if we're concerned with being the New Testament church today, then it becomes important what the New Testament church did whenever you raise a question on that particular matter. And so out of a genuine interest that we be New Testament Christians, I've given some attention to, again, what might in and of itself be a peripheral matter. Well, our attendance has held up rather well, I think, for the last day of lectureship, and I appreciate your interest, and I appreciate very much the very fine spirit, the interest that you've manifested, the concern, the sympathy and encouragement that you have given me in these classes, and we hope that the rest of the lectureship is all that you want it to be. Thank you very much. Thank you. The Christian Church, reading together, studying is really good.
For watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Alright, I hope everyone has a great day.